thanks very much.
It was fantastic. It's and I think for a lot of people who it will be an incredible introduction to so much of a life that, in terms of what it says about the 20th century, about its propaganda, about its paranoia, about its attitude to women. There's so much in it. It's such a dense film. We've only got 20 minutes, so I'm going to just throw questions at you, and I'm going to take questions from the audience as well, because I'm sure there are many of them. The first thing just to ask is, before this project came up, what was Charlie Chaplin to you? Yeah. So who would like to start?
Well, yeah, I mean, we'd both seen some of his films when we were studying and loved them. I think the first one I saw was City Lights, and then Modern Times shortly afterwards. I was instantly struck because I sort of had this idea of Charlie Chaplin before I went into it, that sort of a very cartoonish idea of silent cinema, of sort of super slapstick, and not that slapstick is a bad thing, but he sort of, I think for a lot of people he does represent something, I think partly because of what happened to silent film after talkies came along, right? There was a big campaign when Talking Pictures arrived to sort of denigrate silent film, and often they, because of poor restoration and stuff, have played at the wrong speed, and Chaplin was a real victim as well, because his films were so popular they were duplicated until you couldn't really see him anymore. And so I think I had that sort of conception of it, and I was so struck when I watched those films at just how fresh and modern and subversive that they felt. And then as well, like Peter and I both live in South London, and so very much Chaplin's neighbourhood. In fact, we live just a couple of streets from Fred Karno's Fun Factory, where he and Chaplin and Stan Laurel trained before they went to America. So we kind of you see his presence through those streets, the streets that then he took to Hollywood with him and recreated in his studio, as we say in that bit at the end. But it wasn't really until the project kind of came to us after we made our previous film that we took a really deep dive, and what amazing things to be able to do.
There was one experience very early on in the development period of this where we were doing a kind of a workshop at an artist residency down in Southend, and we were speaking to like a crowd of kids from the age of about 8 to 14 years old, and we were talking to them about Charlie Chaplin. We showed a series of kind of images, the elements of the costume, the hat, the cane, the moustache, and asked them if this meant anything to the audience. And it wasn't very long before hands started shooting up. And actually no one there had actually seen a Chaplin film, but there's just something about Charlie Chaplin that is percolated into the sort of collective cultural memory. And I think that was quite a big moment for us, that we knew that this was, this is something very, very, a subject very special and a great canvas of a life to really kind of delve into.
Where would you start with? So you've got a group of young people and you're going to show them a Chaplin. Which one do you... Because I would imagine, getting that film into under 2 hours, the amount of material that you have, the amount of history to tell, the fact that whatever stories you leave out end up underlining, all of that, incredibly hard decision. So where do you start?
Well, in that instance, we started with some of his shorts, yeah, and actually, we played a few clips from Shoulder Arms, from Easy Street, and we didn't play an entire film to them, but it was clear that there was just something in that reached forward 100 years and spoke to these kids. It is just very relatable. It's such a consummate artistry, isn't he? That he engages the audience, and of course there's that look, that sort of imploring from the screen and reaching out to audiences, and they were in stitches. We were really surprised at just how well they went down, and just how relatable it was, even this from this point in history. And of course, the other significant thing that makes us feel very fortunate to be able to make this film at this point in time is these restorations that have come out in the last 10 years. And I know great friends of the festival, Serge at Lobster Films and many others, the Cinetica di Bologna, have done a lot of work over the last few years, tracing all these prints and restoring them. And these incredible 4K prints of Chaplin's film are just the age just strips off them. The thing that James mentioned there about these second, third generation prints that we were perhaps more used to as a childhood now just isn't the case, and it just makes it so much more accessible, and you really can appreciate that, the great artistry of Chaplin.
For those who don't know, how did this project come to you?
Yeah, well, so it all originated with our producer Ben, who actually his mum is really good friends with Geraldine Chaplin. In fact, he says that Geraldine used to change his nappy. That's how he puts it. Not all the time, I guess. But yeah, he's lovely, and so he'd been chatting to Passion Pictures, who John Batasek and Nicole, who were there, and we were talking to them after we made our previous film, and it all kind of came through that. And then I think Ben had been working, trying to convince the Chaplin family to make this for about 10 years, and I think so. We feel very lucky that they kind of let us loose in their archives, and also we were kind of welcomed, as we said in the introduction, by David Robinson and Kevin. Kevin, who of course we put in the film, would sort of take us up to his flat and dig out reels and put them on a Steenbeck, and we'd be watching stuff with him. And it was a huge process, I think, to begin with, of sort of trying to work out what was out there, what had been said already. And we spent the best part of a year to begin with just immersing ourselves before we kind of shot or made any big decisions. It was just like research. And of course we were keen to try and find things that maybe hadn't been lost or that hadn't seen the light of day for a long time, like the press conference that you alluded to there, which there's a tiny fragment of that had been archived, of people saying, "Are you a communist? Are you a communist?" But it was sort of thought to be lost, the full recording. And after about sort of a year of searching, our researcher managed to track it down to a garage in San Francisco, I think, where it was recorded on wire, and it had been kept in a drawer by the granddaughter of the radio journalist. So that was a big breakthrough, when we find things that haven't really been heard before. And likewise, Effie Wisdom, that had just sat in Kevin Brownlow's in his sort of cupboard for ages. He recorded it and then forgot that he had it. And as soon as we heard that, it kind of came alive to us. There she is, kind of speaking in Chaplin's voice. She says he used to talk like me. And so I think moments like that, we sort of really felt a connection. Likewise with the Merriman interview from the 1960s. And so we tried to put those experiences into the film, because I think we were also conscious that there have been so many great documentaries made about him that rely on the same archive. So it felt important to try and find new angles and new ways in and new ways to kind of be in the room. And the moment that we heard Chaplin describing his version of how he invented the costume, and to think that's never really been heard before was really special.
For sure. And the other thing about that, which again is sort of points to how timely it was and how fortunate we were to come along at this time, is the Merriman recording with Chaplin that threads throughout the film, recorded in 1966, an interview for Life magazine, by far and away the most extensive documentation of Chaplin in his own words. And they spent 3 days going back and forth to Chaplin's house in Switzerland and gaining his confidence and talking through with him, and I think recorded over 16 hours of material. But Chaplin didn't like interviews, and as you can hear from the quality of those recordings, they were done without Chaplin being necessarily aware or conscious, at least, of the recording equipment. There's moments in there where they've been recording for a couple of hours, and Chaplin will turn to Merriman and be like, "You're going to put the tape recorder on?" And Merriman's like, "We're already recording. It's just a microphone sticking out of his hip." And so they really did give a sense of kind of intimacy to those recordings. But the trade-off of that is, of course, the quality. These days, and it's only really been in the last 5 or 6 years that the restoration techniques have come on such that we're able to kind of extract that recording from those original tapes, and so we felt very fortunate to have had the opportunity to do that, for sure.
What about your relationship and your feeling towards Chaplin? Because it is very difficult. I think comedy in particular, when you find out perhaps streaks of cruelty, etc. I mean, I find Peter Sellers, for instance, almost impossible to watch now. I've found out too many things. And those moments, particularly the kind of Lita Gray interviews and the background story, those moments, how has that changed how you feel about his comedy and how you feel about his art?
Such an interesting question. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think that Chaplin's one of the first people for whom that kind of possible crisis sort of existed for, because no one had fame in the way that he had before he came along. Films hadn't circulated around the world really until he was starting to make those shorts, and so the type of fame that he experienced, as we say near the beginning, was brand new. And then also that scandal that he has with Lita Gray, the divorce kind of being so highly publicized, was the biggest and most expensive and most scandalous divorce of its time. So I think, and at the time, I think, though attitudes were slightly different, people were having, I think, to make some kind of choice about about what to do with that information. And Lita, I think, speaks very powerfully about that when she says that people couldn't reconcile what she was saying with this idea that they had of Chaplin from this character on screen, and almost refused to, and didn't know how to put those bits of information together. And I think it's something that clearly still we're like struggling with as a society and still trying to confront. Yeah, I think making the film now particularly, it felt so important that Lita's voice was front and center, telling that story, particularly as she clearly struggled to get that account out there and believed. And I think for us it's also been interesting to see like how the media and the establishment kind of play into that as well. Like the fact that in the Lita Gray case, the media and the political establishment are kind of on Chaplin's side, really, in many ways. That pamphlet that's produced by like the European intellectuals, where they kind of chastise Lita. But then if you fast forward to the 1940s with the Joan Barry scandal, at that point, Chaplin's political statements put him in a very different position. And at that point, Hedda Hopper and the gossip columnists at the time kind of turn on him in concert with J. Edgar Hoover. So it's quite interesting to see how like power also influences how these stories are reported, how Chaplin is able to survive or be kind of taken down by them. And I think that makes it much more complex for us, not to just think about in terms of his behavior, but also about how like society kind of deals with this information and things like that.
Well, I thought, as you said with Joan Barry as well, the fact that she merely becomes something to be used by other people, the fact that she,
Absolutely.
I mean, I was fascinating that she just disappeared once she was incarcerated. That was that.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a few references to, I mean, people have tried to unpack her story a bit more. She ended up living a very secluded life, and her children, I think David Robinson actually has made some contact, or definitely has researched this area very well. But yeah, she pretty much dropped out of public view, and yeah, you can bet that Hedda Hopper and J. Edgar Hoover and probably Chaplin didn't give her much of a second thought thereafter.
Now, in terms of his art, I mean, one of the most amazing bits is City Lights, where is it 534 at one point we see chalked up? I can't remember. You know, that is, you know, the pain of perfectionism. How much, in terms of when you watch a Chaplin now, what different eyes do you see it through from before you started making this film?
Yeah, it's a funny one because like there are entire shadow films that can be and have been constructed. Like there's a version of The Gold Rush, I think, that was completely pirated and reconstructed from outtakes, just from alternate takes. And as like Kevin's film, The Unknown Chaplin explores, like some of the stuff that's cut out is so wonderful and so good. But also just to see, I think, Chaplin discovering the story and finding the story in real time through making it is a wonderful thing. And then when you see that his starting point in films like The Immigrant, the whole premise of the film is found very late in the process, and same as City Lights, it kind of all clicks into place very late in the game, how he's actually just going to set up the central premise of it. I think it's very rare that anyone could work like that now. And it was only the case for Chaplin because he had so much power and independence, and he was so successful that he was able to spend years. No one else was really working like that. And he kept it a secret as well because he didn't want people to think that he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't want people to think that he was just sort of starting without an end point. And so I think, yeah, for us it's enriched it so much to see him get there and to be, and we spent a lot of time in the BFI, like just with outtakes and reels, and it's sort of crushing not to be able to take a deeper dive in terms of the context of the film. But yeah,
there is, yeah, I mean, and undoubtedly in terms of our own process, you know, very much there were moments along the way that felt very much like we were kind of stuck outside those those park gates, doing endless takes. But I mean, if anyone, I mean, I'm sure many of the audience here are probably aware and have probably seen Kevin Brownlow and David Gill's 3-part series, The Unknown Chaplin. Which really does unpack all of his working processes and goes much further than we have the opportunity here, and we'd really recommend that if you're interested in a deeper dive into Chaplin's working processes.
So I presume there is an 8-hour Get Back style version of this that existed at some point, but what was the last thing in terms of removing stories, what was the one that you found the hardest to take out of this?
It probably changes day by day. I mean, we shot quite a lot more around the manoir, and and Dick Merriman and his photographer Roddy's sort of pursuit of Chaplin that didn't really make it in, and some of that stuff was really enlightening in terms of Chaplin's character and in terms of the little empire that he'd built himself there in Switzerland in the latter years of his life. You know, as I say, they were recording. Actually, they would set the tape recorder off in the car, so you hear them walking up to the house, crunching in the snow, knocking on the door, the butler answering, the family scurrying around, conversations with Una at times, and the kids' voices, and there was a real sense of place that we constructed from that. But in the end, it did have to go in service of the film. But there are quite a lot of tantalising kind of archive leads that never quite came to fruition.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that just sort of got away. There's an interview, Chaplin was interviewed by the FBI in 1951 or 52, just before he left, and that was definitely recorded on tape, and we spent a long time with Freedom of Information requests, and it looked like we might find it at one point. We were sort of writing around, hoping that might exist. There's also Paulette Goddard, who Chaplin was married to, or maybe not married to. There's a question of whether they're actually married, but she did 80 hours of interviews with Andy Warhol. He was going to write her biography, and he had his little Sony tape recorder around his neck. And we read some transcript of that, but we couldn't get hold of the tapes, so that was very tantalising. But yeah, there have been so many versions of from what we did have. Maybe not 1 8-hour Get Back style one, but I think maybe 4 or 5 kind of very different films. The narration we added very late in the process, actually, just because we couldn't quite make it work. But there were versions that were just done with voices and just done with mainly Kevin Brownlow's interviews that he'd done. There's another one that Pete says it's much more drama heavy. We recreated this unmade film called The Tramp's New World, which was written by James Agee, where it imagines the tramp wandering through a nuclear holocaust after all human life has been wiped out. And so he's just going through this wasteland as the only surviving member of the human race. And we were going to end the film with that, but it didn't make any sense. So that hurts me a bit.
It's a pity. I like things that don't make sense. They're my favourite thing. We've got quick time for some questions. Would anyone? Yes, over there.
Oh, thank you.
So, just in case you didn't hear that, is the film going to be on wider distribution, and what happened to Charlie Chaplin's mother?
Yeah, I mean, so the first part of the question, this is a bit of a preview. It's being released nationally on the 18th of February, so in a few weeks' time. Yeah. In terms of Chaplin's mother, I mean, that relationship is so central and reverberates throughout his life, and we tried very hard to find materials that could speak to that. Effie was our sort of closest link. I mean, as we were approaching the sort of research process, we were trying as much as possible to find contributors and accounts and first-person testimonies that could speak with direct reference to a particular point in his life. And of course, we're now, in terms of his mother, who was so influential in Chaplin's early years, we're stretching right back into the 19th century there. And so Effie was our closest kind of link. She, after Chaplin went over to the States and started earning a bit of money, Chaplin and his brother Sidney paid for her to be in a care home in Peckham in South London that I think was quite comfortable. And then they brought her over, as we show in the film. They brought her over to the States. And, for her last few years, she lived in comfort, but was clearly very unwell. And Chaplin expended quite a lot of political capital to get her into the US. That was not an easy achievement by any stretch. But yeah, I mean, clearly her early years had quite a devastating impact on her mental health by that point. But she lived in relative comfort for the last few years. Yeah. She passed away in America. She's still buried there. 1928, I think. And
there's a sort of strange parallel for, I think, us in that state that she's in, because she was still sort of hiding food late into her life, and kind of, I think, sort of caught between past and present and difference. Because I think it's been proved pretty conclusively that she was suffering from syphilis, which might have led to the kind of delusionary states that she had. and that there's that Stephen Wiseman book, isn't there, that kind of goes into that. But she was obviously so foundational for Chaplin's like love of mimicry as well. He kind of credits her as teaching him almost everything in terms of they used to sit at the window and gaze at passers-by and do impressions, so that relationship is so important.
Yeah, I mean Chaplin's autobiography, which I'm sure many people would have come across, the first couple of hundred pages of that speak very movingly and evocatively of Chaplin's early years, and you can just see how central his mother was in his development and of his artistry. Yeah.
Oh, there's more than a film. There's an enormous encyclopedia in terms of mothers and creativity and
Well, David Robinson, who was the advisor on the Attenborough Chaplin film in '92, was it? Said that any film version of Chaplin's life should end when he gets to America. I mean, there is just so much in his childhood that's so rich.
Take the question.
I thought it was a wonderful film, but I've got one question. Una's daughter talks about her writing a lot, and then in her last year destroying what she wrote. Do we have any idea why she destroyed it?
So, if only didn't yet, Una Chaplin, why did she destroy all of her writing?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think, so a lot of it that she shared with the family before doing so, but I think it was partly out of loyalty to him, really. I think she felt that she'd written this partly as a kind of process for her. Of course, she was a brilliant writer. Her dad was Eugene O'Neill, and we've read bits and bobs, letters and little extracts of things that have survived, and like the writing is so wonderful. But I think she wrote it as a personal thing. She was courted by a lot of publishers after Chaplin died who wanted her to publish it, but she kind of kept them at bay. And then I think it was really, she thought that this was maybe something that she didn't want to become part of the history.
I mean, the one thing that she did leave is all of those extraordinary 16mm home movies. That's mostly her behind the camera. There's a couple of clips of her there. That's pretty much all we could sort of find amongst the best part of 20 hours worth of home movies. She was really dedicated documenter of family life, and but her writing, but a very private woman.
There's a question. Yes, up there.
You eliminated Sydney totally from
Painfully so. Yeah. There's so much. I mean, it's so tricky. We had a meeting very early on in the process with Bryony Dixon, who works for the BFI archives and is an extraordinary person and very knowledgeable about this period. And I remember her saying to us, the key to Charlie Chaplin's life is Sidney Chaplin. And we kind of had that in mind throughout the entire process. But as we were saying earlier, trying to find direct accounts that spoke to a particular period in Chaplin's life, there is nothing that we could really find of Sidney Chaplin, in his own words, speaking about his relationship with his brother. Fantastic films, fantastic legacy of films in his own right. But yeah, it just fell away. But there is so much more, so much more out there, and so much more of Chaplin's life to be plundered and explored and delved into. So we hope that this provides an entry point for further Chaplin research.
I think we've got time for one more if anyone's got. Oh yes, sorry.
I was going to ask, the archive stuff that you found is astonishing, but am I right in thinking that the interviews with the children, did you do those especially?
Yeah, we did. They were really lovely to us, the Chaplin family. They kind of welcomed us, particularly, Geraldine, Michael, Eugene and Jane, who are the main, and then Annie also spoke to us. They were really opened up. We spoke to for several days, well, not to Geraldine, several hours in different days. And they were really, for us, it's some of the most poignant parts of the film, because I think one of the struggles that we had is that we're making this film about someone who's been long dead, and it feels like at times you're kind of following the footsteps of other biographers, and it all feels kind of like shadows of shadows, which I think is why we were tempted to reconstruct things like Merriman, because we wanted to sort of try and imagine ourselves into those rooms and kind of, because I think it is an imaginative process making like a biography about someone, and so we wanted to kind of embrace that. But with the family, you know, he's still very much alive in their memories and still being reprocessed. I think you really feel that particularly with Geraldine and Michael, who speak so movingly, and Jane, of course, about trying to, I think, still work out that sort of yearning for intimacy that they felt, and obviously because he did have so many barriers, I think it's clear to see, and he did seem to be so hard to kind of reach. So yeah, for us, those are some of the most moving parts of the film, and we're really grateful to the family for speaking to us.
Final thing I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the subjects that you found yourself going into, has this now left you with a project in your head? Whether it's going to exist or not, it's not important, but that fact, did you go, now that is where I want to make a documentary next?
Wow, that's such a good question.
That's a really good question. I mean, Chaplin's life is such an extraordinary canvas. I mean, as hopefully the film kind of touches on, you know, that sort of his arrival in his Dickensian childhood and then his arrival in Hollywood at the birth of cinema, or in America, the birth of cinema, how his life then maps on to the Great Depression and takes us through the sort of the clash of ideologies standing up to Hitler, and then through into the 1950s and the Red Scare, and it was an extraordinary kind of tour of the 20th century for us, the first part of the 20th century, and a thrilling one from our perspectives. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily a project as such, but the what was going on in the 1940s and Edgar Hoover, and it's all pretty well documented. And Chaplin's FBI file, all 2,000 pages of it, is available online. is a pretty wild read. And that area and the way that the institutions of state coalesced around certain artists in the 1940s is a really fascinating and area to explore further. Whether or not that quite amounts to an entire project, it's certainly a very additional reading.
I think we should, at least the entire Effie Wisdom recording, which is about an hour long, needs to be heard from start to finish by as many people as wanted, because it's just absolutely hilarious. And so maybe a film about Effie would be.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming down. We're going to be back. We've got Richard Herring later on, celebration of the goodies, loads of different things. Tim Vine and Kenny Everett tomorrow talking about that, which is going to be excellent. But let's hear it for Peter and James.